Some topics just grab you and won't let go. And near-death experiences, or NDEs, are definitely one of those for me. And I have a feeling you feel the same way.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those mysteries that just keeps drawing you back in.
So let's dive deep into this fascinating world and really explore a new theory about what actually causes them.
Yeah, it's a question that's haunted researchers, for decades. What really happens during a near-death experience? And this new research we're diving into today suggests it all boils down to something, well, pretty radical: the separation of consciousness from the body.
Okay, hold on. Separation of consciousness. Are we talking like our minds detaching from our physical selves? I'm intrigued, but I think we need to back up a bit. You mentioned this is a new theory. So what's been the traditional way of understanding NDEs?
Well, traditionally, research has focused on finding those common threads, the features people report: the light, the tunnel, the feeling of peace. It's almost like researchers were trying to create like a checklist of experiences.
Right.
But this paper takes a different approach. It kind of steps back and suggests that instead of getting, stuck in the what, maybe we should be asking why. Like, what is the underlying mechanism, the root cause that drives these experiences?
It's like seeing one of those warning lights pop up on your car's dashboard. You don't just want to know what the light means. You want to know what's causing it in the first place.
Exactly. You got it. And these researchers, they believe they may have found that root cause, and it's the, at least temporary, separation of what they call the mind entity from the physical body.
The mind entity.
Yeah, you can think of it like your consciousness, your sense of self, your I. But now imagine it existing, at least for a bit, independently, totally separate from your brain and body.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. So they're saying our minds aren't just products of our brains, but separate entities that can just detach. That's a bold claim. What kind of evidence do they have to back up this whole mind-body separation theory?
They present several pretty compelling arguments. And honestly, one of the most intriguing revolves around something called veridical perception.
Veridical perception. Sounds complicated. Break it down for me.
It's actually simpler than it sounds. Veridical perception, it basically refers to those cases where individuals report accurately seeing or hearing things during their NDEs that they couldn't have possibly known through their normal senses, like if they were just remembering things.
Yeah.
And what makes these cases so compelling is that the details they report, they're later verified by others, suggesting these weren't just hallucinations or tricks of a dying brain.
Well, you're saying there are people clinically dead who can accurately perceive events happening around them, even with their senses seemingly shut down. Okay, now you've got my attention. Can you give me an example?
Absolutely. One of the most striking examples involves a man named Al Sullivan. He was undergoing emergency heart surgery, completely unconscious under anesthesia, and they even had his eyes taped shut for the procedure. Yet during the surgery, he reported floating above his body and witnessing the surgeon making these, well, the way he described them, these odd flapping motions with his arms.
Flapping motions? That doesn't sound like typical surgical technique.
It's not. It turns out that this particular surgeon, he had this unusual habit during these specific types of procedures. To avoid contamination, he'd place his hands on his chest and use his elbows to point things out.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a unique quirk that Mr. Sullivan couldn't have known about unless he was actually seeing it from outside his own body.
And he described this accurately. I'm starting to see why this veridical perception thing is so compelling. It really challenges our understanding of how our senses even work. If he wasn't using his eyes, how was he seeing?
That's precisely the question these researchers are grappling with. And it gets even more intriguing when you consider another case, this time involving a patient of cardiac surgeon Lloyd Rudy. This patient, shockingly, had no heartbeat for over 20 minutes. Essentially, he was dead by all medical definitions, yet when he was revived, he was able to recount very specific details of that operating room. The positions of the two surgeons in the doorway, even a chain of Post-it notes on a computer screen.
Hold on, are you serious? 20 minutes with no heartbeat, and he remembers Post-it notes. Okay, that's just...
Yeah.
Wow. So it's not just like vague feelings or images, but clear, verifiable details. And these details defy our conventional understanding of how the brain functions, especially in the absence of a heartbeat.
And these are just two examples among many. The researchers behind this paper have compiled a collection of these veridical perception cases, and honestly, it's hard to ignore the pattern that emerges.
Okay, I'm definitely starting to see why this mind-body separation theory is gaining traction. But you mentioned that veridical perception is just one argument among several. What else did the researchers bring to the table to support their hypothesis?
Well, you see, it's not just about what NDErs perceive while they're having these experiences, it's also how they experience their own consciousness.
Okay.
The researchers point out this remarkable consistency of consciousness that's reported by those who've had NDEs.
Okay.
These individuals go through these really intense, often disorienting experiences, sometimes even with repeated in and out of body episodes. Yet their sense of self, their I, it remains constant throughout.
So even when they're bouncing between this world and whatever they're experiencing during the NDE, they still maintain a core sense of who they are.
Exactly. They don't come back confused about who they are. And there are actually some really interesting cases of these repeated separations and returns that illustrate this point really vividly.
Oh, I love a good story. Tell me more about these yo-yo NDEs, as you call them.
One that comes to mind is the case of Joe McMonigle. During his NDD, which was brought on by convulsions, he found himself repeatedly pulled back into his body each time his friend, who was trying to revive him, struck him in the chest.
Wow, so every time his friend tried to bring him back, it was like he was being yanked back to reality from the NDE.
That's exactly how he described it. And what's so fascinating is that through these repeated transitions, his sense of self remained consistent. It speaks to a certain resilience of consciousness, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It makes you wonder if consciousness is more like a flow that can be interrupted, but not truly broken.
Yeah.
Rather than something that's just like an on-off switch.
That's a great way to put it. And there's another really compelling account from an orthopedic surgeon, Mary Neal, who drowned while kayaking.
Right.
And she described being repeatedly drawn back to her body by the pleas of her friends who were, trying desperately to resuscitate her.
It's almost as if something was trying to keep her tethered to her body, even though part of her had already moved on.
Yeah, and she described each return to her body with this sense of frustration. Like each time she came back, she could feel the limitations of that physical body, the pain, the struggle. And then each time she separated again, she experienced this expanded awareness, this sense of peace.
Wow.
These accounts where people describe being pulled back and forth like this, it really highlights the stark contrast that exists between out-of-body consciousness and our everyday in-the-body experience,
Yeah, it's like they get a glimpse of something bigger, something beyond the limitations of our physical selves, and then they're forced to come back.
Exactly. And it's not just the continuity of the self that stands out in these accounts. It's this distinct difference in how our consciousness seems to operate when it's not bound by that physical body. And the researchers, they really emphasize this point. They argue that when the mind entity is separated, its abilities and perceptions are fundamentally different.
So it's not just about being outside of the body looking in, but about experiencing reality in a completely different way.
Yes, exactly. NDers, they often describe their thinking as becoming crystal clear, almost like they've upgraded their mental processing power,
Yeah.
They report this heightened awareness and ability to perceive things that seem to be beyond our normal senses. Remember those examples of veridical perception we talked about earlier?
Right.
That's just one manifestation of this expanded awareness that they often talk about.
It's like our brains, as amazing as they are, might actually be limiting the full potential of our consciousness.
It's a fascinating possibility to consider, isn't it? It's as if, when it's freed from the constraints of the physical body, the mind entity is capable of operating on another level entirely.
This is blowing my mind a little bit, to be honest. It's like we're catching these little glimpses of a whole other dimension of reality.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, with all this talk of out-of-body experiences and expanded consciousness, how do we know this isn't just imagination? How can we be sure these experiences are telling us something real about the nature of consciousness and not just the result of a stressed brain, for example?
Oh, it's a completely valid question. How do we differentiate between a subjective experience and an objective reality? It's one of the biggest challenges in studying consciousness, right? And while we can't discount the power of the human mind to create these really vivid experiences, the researchers, they argue that there's more to these accounts than just imagination.
Okay, so they're not just taking these NDE stories at face value. They're looking for something more concrete, something measurable.
Precisely. They're searching for evidence that these experiences have real-world implications, something beyond the personal experience of the individual. And they point to several really compelling cases that are harder to dismiss as mere imagination.
Okay, you've got to give me the good stuff. Tell me about these harder-to-explain cases. You've got me on the edge of my seat. What are these harder-to-explain cases?
So, one that really stands out is about a young boy, Jerry Casebolt. During his NDE, he described interacting with a dog on a playground. But And here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just something he was, like, picturing in his head.
Right.
According to witnesses, the dog actually reacted to Jerry, like jumping and playing as if it could actually see him, even though, Jerry was supposedly out of his body.
Okay, now that's interesting. Animals tend to be, pretty straightforward with their reactions. They don't usually play along with hallucinations. It's like the dog was responding to something real, something tangible, even if the people couldn't see it.
Right. That's the thing. It's like whatever Jerry's mind entity was experiencing during his NDE, it might have actually had a real-world presence, like an ability to interact with the physical environment.
That's wild. You mentioned there were other cases like this.
Yeah, there's another one, the case of Olga Gearhart. She appeared to her son-in-law at the exact moment that her newly transplanted heart stopped beating.
Wow.
He saw her, heard her message, and it was as if she was physically present, right there in the room with him, even though she was miles away in the hospital.
So not only can these mind entities potentially interact with the physical world, but they might also be perceivable to other people.
That's what some of these cases suggest, yeah. And it gets even more mind-boggling when you consider the instances where multiple people experience NDEs simultaneously.
Wait, really?
Yeah, and they witness each other in this out-of-body state. They come back with shared experiences, confirming details that would have been impossible to know otherwise.
Hold on. Multiple people having NDEs at the same time. Are you saying these mind entities can interact with each other?
There's this one account that really highlights this. It's about a group of firefighters who were caught in a wildfire. Each firefighter described a really similar experience of being out of their bodies, seeing their own forms on the ground, and even observing each other in this shared out-of-body space.
Wow.
It's incredible, right? I mean, it makes you wonder, what if there's this collective dimension of experience beyond our individual awareness?
This is all incredibly compelling stuff. But I have to imagine studying something as subjective and elusive as NDEs, it must be a huge challenge for these researchers. How do they even begin to measure and categorize these experiences in a scientific way?
You're absolutely right. It's a huge challenge. And that's where the researchers behind this paper, they took a really interesting approach. They utilized something called Grayson's NDE scale, which is basically this widely used questionnaire that was originally developed to assess and standardize reports of NDEs.
So it's based on those common features we talked about earlier, the light, the tunnel, the out-of-body sensations.
Exactly. So they took this existing scale and they meticulously went through each item and categorized it based on its relevance to this mind-body separation framework.
Okay, so how does that work?
So some items, like the out-of-body experience itself, were labeled as essential, meaning they're considered strong indicators of this mind-body separation. Other items, like encountering a bright light, were categorized as derivative, like they're likely to occur alongside the separation, but not necessarily proof of it.
Yep.
And then you had the incidental items, things like feelings of peace, joy, which are common in NDEs, but they can also occur in other contexts.
So they basically sorted the NDE checklist into different levels of relevance to their separation hypothesis, like the must-haves, the maybes, and then the interesting but not conclusive. What did they find when they analyzed the data through this new lens?
Well, here's where it gets really exciting. By analyzing a large data set of NDE accounts, they discovered that 5 of these essential items, so those core indicators of mind-body separation, were present in almost 99% of all the NDEs they looked at.
So they found this consistent pattern, like a fingerprint of separation that seems to exist across a vast majority of NDEs.
Exactly. And that's huge because this shift, right, from simply listing features to actually identifying a potential underlying mechanism, it opens up entirely new avenues for research. Instead of just asking, what did you see? We can start to explore what happens to consciousness when it's no longer bound by those physical constraints of the brain.
It's like we're finally starting to ask the right questions. Questions that could lead us to a true understanding of what consciousness actually is, how it operates, not just within our bodies, but potentially beyond.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of this new framework. If NDEs do, in fact, suggest this separation of consciousness from the body, it really challenges us to rethink our understanding of what it means to be human. It raises profound questions about the relationship between the mind and body, about the nature of reality itself.
And the possibility of consciousness existing independently of our physical forms, right?
Exactly. These are questions that, philosophers, scientists, they've been grappling with for centuries. But now, thanks to this really cutting-edge research, we might just be one step closer to actually finding answers.
It's like every time we dig a little deeper into this mystery of consciousness, we just uncover more layers of intrigue. And that's what makes this whole topic so captivating. So, for all of you listening, if these NDEs are teaching us anything, it's that the nature of reality might be far more expansive, far more mysterious than we ever dared to imagine. And that's something worth pondering, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, something to think about.